G'day, this is Joseph Drury from the Institute of Public Policy and Governance. Week 5's topic is local government debt. Local government debt is something that concerns me a lot. It doesn't seem to be concerning the regulators at all. And in fact, we've got regulators in some states running about and encouraging councils to take on additional debt. Other states, we have consultants who are experts in their field running about encouraging councils to take on debt. They all seem to be oblivious to the fact that there's a debt crisis amongst local governments. Overseas, you can look at a bankruptcy map in the US of councils that are going bankrupt because they can't afford to pay back their debts. In South America, in Germany, in China, in Japan. Local government debt can be a problem in terms of financial sustainability. But there's a bigger problem with local government debt. It's an ethical problem. Now, I think the problem comes about, or the misunderstanding comes about, because people don't understand what debt is. All debt does is bring forward future taxation revenues at a cost, at a very considerable cost in most times. Obviously not now with the bond rate so low. Now, it's not a way of creating new revenues at all. It's been presented this way. It was presented this way in a recent state inquiry. It's simply a way to bring forward future taxation revenues. Now, if you take on debt, what that means is that future people will have to pay off the debt. Pretty obvious. Now, if the debt is taken on for operational expenditure, for things that are consumed this year and cease to exist after this year, that's a real moral problem, because what you're effectively doing is asking future generations to pay for something that this generation has already consumed. It's like me going overseas, not taking you, bringing my credit card, and when I get home, walking up to you and saying, pay off this credit card bill. Why should you? You didn't consume the holiday? You didn't have a say in whether I took the holiday or not? Why should you pay back the debt? And exactly the same applies to future generations. Why should they pay off the debt for something they didn't consume, for something they never gave their consent to, for something they never had a say in? And this is what's called the moral hazard of debt. Moral hazard applies to a lot of things in economics, most notably insurance. There's a moral hazard, and moral hazard exists because there will always be a temptation for this generation to bind future generations to pay for the cost of things that we want to consume right now. It's an incredibly tempting idea. And in fact, there's a big literature talking about the debt bias. If you're a resident who doesn't envisage that they're going to continue living in the local government area for long, or if you're an older person who probably won't be around for the 20 to 30 years it might take to pay off the debt, it's actually a rational decision to prefer debt over other ways of funding consumption. What are the other ways of funding consumption? Fees or higher taxes. Of course you would prefer debt because someone else will be paying off part of the debt if you don't intend on living in the local government jurisdiction long enough to service the debt. Now, this debt bias, as I mentioned, is particularly prominent amongst older citizens, and one of the interesting things about a lot of local government areas is that the councils have a concentration of a certain demographic. They tend to be older, they tend to be male, and that will encourage them to have a different perspective on debt than what might a younger person or a person with young children. I'm particularly conscious of this. I have young children. I don't believe they should be paying off debt for something they'll never see, for something they never had a say in. Now, it's not just happening at the local government level. It's happening at the state level. Some states have got themselves in horrendous debt problems, Queensland for instance. And it's happening at the federal government level. The last time I checked, there was about $400 billion in debt there that my children will have to pay off for services that we've consumed already. It's quite wrong. Now, there is an argument, okay, sometimes debt is good. Well, I completely reject that. I don't think there's ever such a thing as good debt. but I would say that sometimes debt is acceptable. It's always preferable that we pay for things now. Just as it is in your personal budget, that it's preferable that you pay for things straight away, if at all possible. Now, what sort of debt might be acceptable? Well, capital investment. Building a road or a bridge could be acceptable because this asset will live for quite some time. So the people who are paying off the debt, the future generations, will at least get to use the asset. Now, it depends on what the asset is, first of all. If it's a monument to your local mayor, I don't think future generations will thank you for paying off a debt for a statue that they don't want. But if it's infrastructure that's likely to be useful into the future, it could be reasonable. However, it's not even that clear-cut either. There are still some problems. First of all, we, or this generation, inherited our infrastructure completely unencumbered in most cases. Local governments had very little debt up till 10-20 years ago. Why should we get our infrastructure unencumbered with no debt, yet claim that it's only fair that the future generation pays some cost towards the infrastructure they'll inherit? It's a double standard. It's quite hypocritical. So to have intergenerational equity in the future, we must obviously have to be prepared to visit inequity on the previous generation. There's also some problems. We can't predict the useful life of assets. I've written many papers on unexpected depreciation problems, and there's even more papers in the literature showing quite clearly that we're really quite poor at predicting the life of a long-lived asset. If we can't predict the life, it's hard to be able to come up with a debt product which has repayments in proportion to the expected consumption of that asset. There's further problems. For instance, do the debt products actually exist in Australia? If we build this bridge that's expected to live for 100 years, does a debt product exist in Australia for us to take out a loan over 100 years and pay it back in proportion to the expected consumption of that bridge over time? Will we start repaying the payments on this bridge straight away, or will we delay it, or have an unreasonable proportion pushed forward to that next generation? It's always going to be very, very tempting to get someone else to pay for what we want now, especially when that someone else doesn't have a voice, they don't vote, and by the time they find out they've got this problem, it'll be too late for them to do anything about it. So it's not clear-cut even on capital spending. I reject entirely the claim that you must have debt in order to have intergenerational equity. As I've just finished explaining, there's a whole heap of problems with that, not least the fact that we, in the most part, got our assets without any debt. So I've said here in the readings that, and I stated earlier, that in all likelihood the next financial crisis might be a subnational debt crisis. There's certainly a lot of subnational debt sloshing around, particularly in China and America. But in Australia, we conveniently forget we've already had our first case of financial insolvency for a government in Australia. The council in far western New South Wales was put into administration because they couldn't service their overdraft. Now, encouraging councils to take on debt with cognizance of the situation in the world, with cognizance of what already has happened here in New South Wales, seems a little bit irresponsible. It seems even more dangerous to encourage councils to take on debt without first modelling what debt they have the capacity to service. Now, if you or I go into a bank to get a home loan, they'll ask us about our wage and our expenses and our commitments to see if we can afford the loan. That's what debt modelling is. You can do that on a local government basis, and I've given you an example of a paper in your readings where they show how you can do that. But no one's actually done that in Australia. So we have people running around encouraging councils to take on debt, but they haven't modelled the capacity of the council to repay debt. That's the same as walking around the street, if you're a bank, handing out home loans without asking the people if they have a job and whether they have any intentional capacity to pay back the home loan. It's just very, very risky behaviour. Now, since I did up the notes for this subject, I've actually found some interesting readings for you. There's one by Rose on debt breaks. It's a fiscal institution commonly used in America, but also in Europe, and also balanced budget legislation. There's another one from the great Buchanan on balanced budget legislation, not directly relevant to debt, but he does mention debt. And there's a very good paper by McEhan on the medium voter hypothesis and debt. That's well worth a look, particularly if you're taking debt as your topic for your first assignment. I've also added a paper which I've recently had accepted in a journal. It's not the published version, it's only the version that I submitted and had accepted. It looks at this problem of debt. It talks about the two types of debt. It talks about unacceptable debt and acceptable debt. I really hate these terms, good debt and bad debt, because there's never good debt. There's acceptable debt and there's unacceptable debt. And it proposes a political institutional fix to make sure that we can get debt under control. Also in that paper, I present some statistics on the growth of debt in OECD jurisdictions for local governments. It's incredible. The figure you will find when you read the paper is quite staggering. It should give you cause for concern. It gives me lots of cause for concern. As I say, all these issues you read about this week completely also applicable to state governments, some of whom have racked up huge debts, which one must wonder if they're serviceable, and federal governments, which can service their debt, but at one stage was racking it up at a faster rate than the Greeks prior to their sovereign debt crisis. I'm not suggesting by any stretch of the imagination that we have an impending sovereign debt crisis in Australia. Let me be very clear about it, but the rate at which we're accumulating debt is rather scary, particularly when we struggle to get a surplus. Will we ever get a surplus? We've been promised many surpluses. There's a structural problem in our budget. It won't balance because we have high welfare liabilities in particular and low tax receipts. Is it reasonable? Is it just and equitable to be racking up debt to pay, on the whole, welfare entitlements that will be consumed now and asking future generations to pay for it? See, this is the thing about debt. It may be promoted as the debt is for this capital infrastructure, but spending, as those of you who are CFOs are well aware, spending in a budget is very fungible, is the term. You can take on debt for a capital project, something that you had put savings away for, reserves away for, and then use those reserves to fund operational expenditure. And what that effectively means is that the operational expenditure is being funded through the debt. Think about it for a minute, it's a bit tricky, but by moving funds that you'd set aside for capital works into operational expenditure and taking a debt instead to fund the capital works, you're essentially, in effect, taking on debt for operational expenditure. And as we've said, that's completely unacceptable. I hope you do enjoy the readings, particularly the paper that I've put up that I've had recently accepted. It is quite a unique and innovative paper. Please keep it to yourself, students, until such time as it actually appears in publication at the A-Rank journal where it's been accepted. It shouldn't be disseminated beyond the students, but you can quote it if you decide to do that as your assignment topic. Okay, trust you enjoyed that. I trust you enjoy the readings this week, and I hope you're thinking about your assignments, which are due in the near future. And I'll leave you with that for this week. Until